Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's weekly webinar. I'm Bill Emmott and I'm chairman of the Japan Society. As the attendees are gradually being admitted to this webinar, let me once again thank all the Society's members and friends for your continued support during these strange and difficult times for all of us and for all of your companies, and for many of you for your regular attendance at many of these webinars and at the Society's cultural events. This week, we move away from a strictly bilateral UK-Japan nexus and cast our eyes and our minds into Japan's immediate neighborhood, the Korean Peninsula, events on which have for centuries been a major strategic concern for Japan, and for decades have been a major issue for peace and stability in the whole world. I think it would be uncontroversial to say that the most memorable and innovative events during the presidency of Donald Trump have been the three encounters between President Trump and Kim Jong-Un of North Korea, events assisted by the mediation of President Moon Jae-in of South Korea, and events in which naturally the government of Japan took a deep interest. Throughout my time watching events in East Asia, which is I suppose about 35 years, 3 points have been constant about the Korean Peninsula. The first is that despite, or perhaps because of, knowing so little about what is going on in the closed totalitarian state of North Korea, predictions about its future have tended to say that the regime cannot survive forever, but is in no apparently imminent danger of collapse. Second, that North Korea has been pursuing the development of a missile-borne nuclear weapons capability amid efforts to persuade it to cease and dismantle that, which ultimately have proved unsuccessful. And third, that South Korea has successfully moved towards a deeper and ever more firmly entrenched democracy during those 3.5 decades, but one in which presidents seem invariably to end the single term they are entitled to in some form of retreat or even disgrace. And now these three constants remain combined. Recent months have seen much speculation even about the possible death of the still youthful Kim Jong-un when he disappeared from the scene for several weeks, speculation that proved, in fact, as Mark Twain said, rather premature, but also speculation about the rise to prominence of his sister, Kim Yo-jong. These months have seen further evidence of North Korea's dedication to its nuclear weapons as part of its security strategy, and no sign of denuclearization, as was discussed in Singapore, Hanoi, and at Panmunjom during those meetings, amid a fresh round now of provocative acts by the North towards the South in particular. And those acts have presented President Moon Jae-in with a difficult choice about how to respond and how to rescue one of his signature policy initiatives. His term in office might hope to be remembered for his government's good handling of the coronavirus, but could equally be remembered for policy towards the North. So what is happening? What might happen next? And what role might the US and Japan play? To peer into this fog, I am delighted to welcome two quite exceptional scholars and experts on and in the region. In Seoul, I welcome Chung Lee, who is a long-time scholar on international security at Yonsei University in Seoul, and before that at other institutions in America and South Korea, and now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, previously in Washington, D.C., but now based in Seoul. Chung served as his country's ambassador for national security affairs from 2013 to 2016. Last year, in fact, he published this excellent book, which I am delighted to plug, The Hermit King, The Dangerous Game of Kim Jong-un. I wholeheartedly recommend it as a guide to what's going on. And from the UK, but joining us from his home in Paris, I welcome our old friend John Nilsson-Wright, Senior University Lecturer in Japanese Politics at Cambridge University and Korea Foundation Korea Fellow at Chatham House. So John is that very rare thing, a scholar of the politics both of Korea and of Japan. Both of our speakers will open with 10 minutes of remarks, following which, as usual, we'll have a discussion and, most important of all, your questions. As before, please submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are going to start in Seoul with Chung-Min Lee. Over to you, Chung-Min.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. And let me tell you what a delight it is to be joining all of you through the webinar of the Japan Society in the UK. The last time I had an event with the Japan Society was based in New York several years back. So this is a really good moment to rekindle my ties with the Japan Society. And John, obviously, I've known you for a long time, as well as your beautiful wife. And so it's a delight to be reconnected again with you. So let me just briefly give you my, take on what's happening on the peninsula for the last, 3-4 weeks. I say that President Moon Jae-in, President Donald Trump, and Chairman Kim Jong-Un were the three principal leaders of the last 2 years who really wanted to make a difference from their own unique perspectives. They shared the same bed, as it were, but they came out with three different dreams. And as a result, I think what we are seeing in Korea today is a large U-turn. And that U-turn, I believe, is going to result in more prolonged uncertainty in inter-Korean ties, despite President Moon's ardent desire to create what he calls an irreversible peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And why do I say there is going to be a U-turn as we speak? You recall that in the fall of 2017, President Trump and Chairman Kim were boasting about which side had a larger nuclear weapon to destroy the other side. And in the winter of February of 2018, President Moon Jae-in invited Kim Jong-un's emissary, his sister, Kim Yo-jong, to the Pyeongchang Olympic Games, which began this period of inter-Korean détente. And so in 2018, as you all know, we had three critical inter-Korean summits, including the September Pyongyang visit, which President Moon declared to be the epitome of his détente period. And then you had the Singapore meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un in June of that year, which was a highlight of US-North Korea relations, followed by the second summit in Hanoi in February 2019, which unfortunately collapsed. So the key issue is, why did these three leaders converge and why are they moving apart? Well, that's because from the very onset, they had very different goals. Kim Jong-un wanted sanctions relief without giving up nuclear weapons. President Moon wanted to make a peace deal with North Korea, but understanding that the road towards denuclearization would be very, very hard and perhaps impossible. And Donald Trump wanted any deal as far as I'm concerned. He wasn't worried about the details, but being so critical of Obama's Iranian deal, the Paris Climate Change Accord, and so forth, Trump badly needed a foreign policy victory. But after these three leaders did their respective summits, at the working level, they simply could not agree that this was an easy task. And I think as a result, Kim Jong-un faced a critical dilemma. In other words, he has to promote and to accelerate the nuclear weapons program because the South Korean forces are getting much more modernized. And he wants to do this because it is a critical legacy program for Kim Jong-il, his late father, and also his grandfather, the founding father, leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. So Kim Jong-un wants to expedite and finish the nuclear weapons program as much as he can, so that he can negotiate from a position of strength. For President Moon, however, the window is closing. He has a little bit less than 2 years before he leaves office in May 2022. And although his party won a resounding victory in this year's parliamentary election, President Moon really doesn't have that much of leverage anymore. And Donald Trump, as we all know, faces crucial elections in November, and chances are he might even lose to Joe Biden. So from all those perspectives, I think President Moon wants to give this a one last shove for peace. And again, I guess a couple of days ago, President Moon intimated in an interview that he wants Donald Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un one more time. I don't think that's going to be really possible for a number of reasons: logistical, political, and strategic. So then what do we have for the future? I think South Korea now stands at a very critical moment because we are now entering into a period where the South Koreans not only have to deal with a much more powerful North Korea in a nuclear sense, we're dealing with a much more assertive China. And for the first time in the last 30 years, I think the China factor is going to become one of the most, if not the single most important driver on Korean security at a time when the US position in Asia in relative terms is declining. So as a result, that's going to create many more dilemmas for the South Koreans. Last but not least, this is a problem that I think both Japan and Korea faces. We are both very advanced economies with similar, I guess, infrastructure, but our societies are aging very rapidly and our population basically shrinking. So for example, in the South Korean armed forces, we expect the armed forces to shrink from about 610,000 today to about 100,000 in the next 5 years or so, because the people, the manpower simply isn't sustainable. So both Korea and Japan face huge economic hurdles as we go into very low growth periods, compounded by the fact that we have a rising China and a much more problematic North Korea. So let me end there.
Well, thank you very much, Chung-Min. That's marvelous. We were hoping for personal revelations from your latest cup of tea with Kim Yo-jong, but nevertheless, I think that you've given us a very good picture, particularly of the strategic dilemmas facing both Kim Jong-un and, very critically, your own president, Moon Jae-in. Well, we'll look forward to getting further into that during discussion. I'm going to go to Paris to John Nilsson-Wright and see how things look from Paris, but also from Chatham House.
Bill, thank you very much. And Chung-Min, let me just echo your thoughts. It's great to be back in touch, virtually speaking, as it were. I thought what I'd try and do in my 10 minutes is ask the question, how precarious is the current situation? Because we all know, of course, North Korea is a real and present danger, to use the language of the Cold War, in terms of its capabilities, the incremental but steady and worrying increase in North Korea's nuclear capacity, those 6 nuclear tests, the commitment on the part of Kim Jong-un to do, as Chung-Min was pointing out, venerate the memory of his father and grandfather before him. All of these factors, I think, are powerful evidence that we need to take the North Korean challenge seriously. And there have been developments, not just the obvious ones, missile tests and nuclear weapons expansion and the acquisition of fissile material, but the role of North Korea, for example, in terms of its cyber threat, reports by the FBI over the last few months describing the persistence with which the North presents itself as a challenger to the region and further afield that make us, I think, legitimately concerned. Also, I think, again, demonstrating, I think, one of those eternal truths of analysing North Korea, the international media keeps getting it wrong. The leadership remains resilient, despite all of those rather fervid speculations in April that the man at the top is on his deathbed. We now know, of course, that he remains very clearly in charge, notwithstanding all of the speculation about a potential successor in the form of his sister. But of course, it's not only a question of assessing the capabilities of the regime. We also, again, to use the Cold War framework, need to think about the intentions. And recent developments suggest that Kim is increasingly impatient. The stalling of progress in bilateral talks with the Americans in Hanoi back in February of 2019 has, I think, underscored the extent to which his aspirations have not been realized, despite all of the energy devoted to dialogue with the United States. Sanctions are still painful, and that's not only a function of pressure from the United Nations and individual countries, but of course, the broader changes in the international environment and COVID-19 are increasingly imposing real pain on the regime. A 24% drop, for example, in trade with China. One can see for North Korea, a country so heavily dependent on its bilateral relationship with China, this is going to have a real impact. And there are reports from South Korean analysts of foreign currency shortages in Pyongyang, of panic buying, of restrictions on the imports of consumer goods that suggest the ambitious plans of Kim Jong-un to develop the economy as part of the so-called Byungjin line are not being realized. So it's perhaps no surprise that we saw him engage in that very characteristic pattern of diplomatic brinkmanship with South Korea. Part of that, of course, is symbolic politics, the detonation of the liaison mission in Kaesong, the very clear language to the Trump administration that time is running out if there is any hope of restarting diplomatic talks. Talk of hints of potential further nuclear tests, speculation on the part of analysts that we might see low-level provocations, whether it's in the Northern Limit Line, the re-establishment of guard posts in the DMZ. All of that very much part of the playbook of the North Koreans, but I think consistent with a leader who is willing to take risks, albeit in a highly calibrated fashion. And Chung-min is absolutely right. This represents a real setback for President Moon's ambitions. Sunshine has undoubtedly been eclipsed, whether it's temporary or permanent. It's a real setback. And those dramatic successes of the administration in the April 15th elections in South Korea are not an endorsement from the South Korean public, I would say, in support of Sunshine, but simply a demonstration of support for the Moon administration's ability to handle the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19, some had speculated, might open the door for a renewal of contact between the two Koreas. But of course, it's part of the sense of infallibility that the North Korean regime wants to underscore that has prevented that from really developing into an active bilateral dialogue. There are other areas where we might see low-level cooperation to deal with other health-related issues. Swine flu has been described as one area where there might be room for cooperation, but these are very, very minor areas for cooperation. And the North will continue to pressure Seoul, not so much to impose pressure specifically on Moon himself, but I think because the route, oddly enough now, to Washington is running through Seoul. And what the North Korean regime is attempting to do, with a measure of success, is to encourage the Moon administration to reach out to Donald Trump. And all of that discussion about a possible summit meeting before the November election is indicative of that, to try and encourage Washington to come back to the negotiating table. Donald Trump, however, has no incentive to do that. He is both distracted by domestic events at home, and also, I think, a rather underreported event, which I'd like to highlight to think about some both contemporary dangers and historical parallels. Just 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump gave a speech at West Point to the graduating class. And in language that seemed to evoke his inner Neville Chamberlain, the president remarked that the United States would no longer be engaged in ancient conflicts in faraway places of which the American people know very little. Whether that's a direct reference to the Korean Peninsula or not is perhaps immaterial at this point. It sends a signal, however, that is potentially destabilizing, particularly in a context where America's relations with its critical allies in Northeast Asia, South Korea and Japan, are increasingly experiencing strain, whether it's over the issue of host nation support, the more transactional approach of Donald Trump, doubts about the reliability of extended deterrence, notwithstanding the deep structural ties that link Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. This president is changing the rules of the game in a way that could be quite provocative and unpredictable. And in this context, of course, looking ahead for the next few months, there are potential points of added tension. Joint operations between South Korean and American troops scheduled for August. The 70th anniversary of the Korean Workers' Party in October. Could this lead to some sort of October surprise ahead of the November elections when an impatient Kim Jong-Un decides that he does in fact want to ratchet up pressure again? I'm not going to make a prediction, but I do think it's something that we're going to need to watch. And in all of this, the last point that I'd make is the question of what other actors might do in this context. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about the role of Japan. Under Prime Minister Abe, of course, pressure and dialogue has been the familiar refrain, with more emphasis on pressure and a reluctant acceptance of dialogue in the wake of Singapore and Hanoi. But I think the sentiment of the Japanese leadership continues to remain firmly fixed on pressure. And of course, domestic politics, particularly the question of Japanese abductees, remains a major impediment for Japan doing any more in a substantive sense. And of course, Kim Jong-un has shown no willingness to meet with his Japanese counterpart. If that weren't serious enough reason to worry, of course, we have the very real limitations in cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo, a function in part of history, the continuing tension over comfort women, and the potentially explosive issue of compensation for slave labour during the colonial period, an issue which threatens to break out again and perhaps further undermine bilateral cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. I won't say much about China because I'm sure we'll come back to that, but my conclusions at the moment are very negative in terms of the prognosis. Trump is disengaged potentially from the North Korean issue, suffering from his own form of alliance attention deficit syndrome. Alliance coordination is poor as a result of the re-emergence of historical and emotional issues that are not purely confined to Northeast Asia. China and Russia show precious little inclination to engage in a constructive way to break the deadlock over the North Korean issue. And as I say, we have an impatient, risk-embracing leader in the form of Kim Jong-Un, who may be minded to provoke in ways that provide more uncertainty. But I'll stop there and look forward to our discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Marvelous, John. Thank you so much. That's been very, very clear and beautifully comprehensive as well. I think you're right that we need to discuss more about China. And I will follow up with a question or two about China's role and China's status in a moment. But I'm going to start with probing a bit further in maybe an extension of some things that you said. I'll refer to Chung Min first about the state of North Korea. I mean, economically amid COVID-19. Let me probe a bit further about what do we know about the state of North Korea's economy and its current, if you like, economic incentives. What's happened to trade with China? What's the prospect for that as China relaxes some of its controls related to COVID-19? Chung-min, what's the view from Seoul? And then we'll come back because John has already mentioned some of this. We'll come back.
I think you're asking the $64,000 question, Bill, and that is namely all the things that Kim Jong-un wants to do: build his nuclear arsenal, other WMD programs like ballistic missiles, maintain a 1.3 million sized armed forces, and then make a living standard better for his people as he promised several years back. All of that comes down to one thing: he needs hard currency. And that hard currency for North Korea has basically dried up. Not all of it, but much of it. And in January 2020, when the COVID pandemic began to spread outside of the Sino-North Korean border, North Korea basically shut off its borders. They have said so far officially not a single North Korean has suffered from the COVID pandemic. Nobody believes them, but that's the fictitious fairy tale they maintain. But underneath, from all sorts of sources, we understand the North Korean economy is suffering as we speak. One, because the level of Sino-North Korean trade has plummeted over the last several months, although there are some reports unconfirmed the Chinese are providing food and fuel to North Korea because of the endemic food shortages in North Korea to begin with. Second, the amount of foreign reserves in North Korea, it really depends on what figures you see. It's a very, very small sum compared to South Korea or even Japan. So that what Kim has done over the last several months, he used up his very depleted foreign reserves to buy critical strategic goods, which he cannot afford. And then the third thing was he expected some type of an economic boom from the South Koreans, but of course everything stopped. Now Moon Jae-in wants to give a huge aid package to Kim Jong-un, but even with a domestically, population that is supportive of some type of humanitarian assistance, South Koreans will not support giving a so-called mini martial aid to Kim Jong-un without any tangible progress on denuclearization or dampening down tensions. So on all those three fronts, Kim Jong-un's dollar bank account, or Office 39 to be more specific, is dwindling as we speak. And the UN sanctions that have been going on since 2016 and 2017 have placed a huge pressure on the key pipeline of sending North Korean workers overseas to China and Russia mainly. these are basically indentured slave laborers. They work 24 hours virtually, and almost all of their pay is remitted back to North Korea. So from that perspective, Kim Jong-un realizes there really is no way out. And the only way out he has economically now is being as close as he can with China to get as much aid from the PRC as possible. But he also realizes that in this COVID economy, the Chinese are not going to run, a blank check to Kim Jong-un. So he is on this holding pattern, and I think that is perhaps his biggest constraint as we move forward on the economic issue. And of course, Donald Trump, being Donald Trump, may want to give some sanctions relief, but I think the US Congress will be adamantly opposed to any type of sanctions relief to North Korea at this time. So in that sense, Kim Jong-un is between a rock and a hard place economically.
John, I mean, you rightly said that the key thing about the North Korean regime has been its resilience, and how often media or indeed scholarly expectations that some kind of crunch is arriving have been proved wrong, and indeed most notably during the 1990s with the famines. How much does the current economic situation really matter, do you think, to Kim Jong-un?
It's a really tough question, isn't it? Because there's the raw data that Chung-min rightly highlights in terms of the impact of sanctions. And then there's this critical question of perceptions. To what extent can we be certain that Kim Jong-un feels his people's pain for simple opportunistic reasons? We know that a few years ago in his New Year's address, he appeared to make himself a hostage to fortune by saying very publicly, "I will never ask the North Korean people to tighten their belts again." And I think many of us seeing that were very surprised, because it seemed to box him in. He's resiled from some of that language over the course of the last few months, which I suppose circumstantially suggests that the pain is becoming more acute. But of course, the nature of this regime means that the leadership only needs to focus primarily, in the first instance, on its own security and its own interests. It's the fact that the cost of these sanctions is having an impact on the elite in Pyongyang that I suppose encourages us to believe that we should stay the course with sanctions. But there is a debate, of course, amongst analysts when it came to thinking about the motivations on the part of Kim Jong-un to first join those important summit meetings with Donald Trump. There was, I think, a legitimate argument that said this was less about offsetting the pressure of sanctions and more because of the confidence that achieving that military strength through the development of the nuclear program gave the leadership. So I'm going to hedge because I don't know. And I think that's the safest path to adopt at the moment. It raises another interesting question, however, I think, which links to some of the questions that have been coming through on Q&A. Which president, if Donald Trump loses and Joe Biden takes over, is more likely, in a sense, to be effective in pursuing pressure on North Korea? So far as I can see, at the moment, the Biden campaign is more likely to embrace some form of strategic patience in the expectation that sanctions will work. But the view on the part, of course, the Moon administration and President Moon's closest advisor, Chung In-moon, Chung-min's former colleague at Yonsei University, who came out very publicly a few weeks ago at a press conference, very critical of the Trump administration and the US position, saying, in effect, providing economic assistance will actually be the critical incentive to get the North Koreans back to the table and open up the door for a possible agreement. So that suggests to me that not only is the divergence of views between Washington and Seoul a problem, but there is this question of perceptions within the North Korean leadership, and linked to that, the issue of trust. How do we establish what each side is looking to achieve? And in a way, it kind of echoes the point that Chung-min was making at the beginning of his presentation, that these three leaders have had very different expectations, even if their common goal has been to minimize tensions and stabilize their own respective governments.
So Chung-min, yes, I mean, let's follow on that point. There have been a couple of questions coming in about this. John Nash has asked, given that the Republicans may lose the presidential election in November, do we know how the Democrats view current Korean Peninsula conditions? David Warren former British ambassador to Tokyo and my predecessor as chair of the Japan Society, one of the questions he's asked is would North Korea, like China, prefer a Trump 2 or a Biden presidency? Chung-Min, you've been a long-time resident of...
I think it's going to be very difficult to say, but my heart tells me that if Donald Trump wins in November, I don't think that's going to happen, but if he does, there will be more repercussions for South Korean ties with the US in terms of asking the South Koreans to pay up to, for example, what Donald Trump wants is $5 billion per annum for host nation support. And he also wants the Japanese to pony up even a larger amount of money. And the two sides have been negotiating for the last year and a half. But on North Korea, I think Trump will basically have a second wind, maybe towards the fall of 2021, if he does win. But I think if Biden wins, and here I'm speaking more as a person who hopes Biden will win as well, I think Biden will bring to the table a much more practiced, experienced, nuanced foreign policy team, whether it's Susan Rice or people in the press have been talking about, for example, Senator from Utah as a possible Secretary of State. We really don't know. But the most important point is Joe Biden in the Senate had over 30 plus years as a leading member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and later its chair. He served as 8 years as vice president, knows almost all the world leaders intimately. So I think Biden knows instinctively what works or doesn't work on North Korea. And I think in that sense, he would probably assume a much more stern position than Donald Trump. I don't think Biden will wave off President Moon's wishes for détente, but I think he will be much more circumspect in dealing with President Moon in his if he wins this year. In terms of what was the second question about the former ambassador? Just quickly.
Well, it was also North Korea. Which would its preference be? Would it like?
Yes.
Read the China.
I think like China, like Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-Un really wants Trump to win because he believes that Trump, number one, doesn't have a sense of history. Number two, he's a totally transactional leader. Number three, he doesn't listen to aides or trusted envoys. He listens to his gut and whoever tells him that he's got the biggest, ego in this world. So of course, Kim Jong-un really wants Donald Trump to win. But I think in that sense, the North Koreans, however, being realistic, understand that they might get Biden.
Thank you. Yes. Will it be interesting to see whether either side make any efforts to try to influence the result, of course. A couple of people have come through with similar questions about China's strategy, and perhaps let's move on to that. Richard Shiver has said, thank you for the discussion, very interesting. I would like to hear thoughts on what China's strategy is with regard to North Korea and how this will play out with respect to South Korea and Japan. And David Warren, they asked a similar question about China's role on the assumption that the US is now moving towards isolationism. John, what's your feeling about China? And then we'll come back to Seoul.
Well, as a non-China hand, my impression is primarily that China is now seeing the opportunity, if you like, to play the North Korea card in the context of growing trade tensions between the US and China itself. China, of course, is not in a position to necessarily deliver North Korea, a more compliant North Korea, because of North Korea's long history of autonomy and self-reliance, more a rhetorical commitment, but in terms of its political position, the North Koreans, of course, are fiercely protective of their political autonomy. And of course, we now know, thanks to the recently published report of the UN panel of experts, that China has been facilitating a lot of the material trade between the two countries, ensuring that North Korea continues to export its critical resources of coal. And I think that's an indication that the Chinese aren't serious about maintaining pressure on the North Koreans, and that serves their interests. At the same time, Their official position when it comes to negotiations is the maintenance of the so-called dual track approach, which of course failed dramatically in Hanoi. There was no obvious opportunity for Washington and Pyongyang to agree on a way forward. And again, further confirmation of those different expectations. But I think one question that is harder to answer is what happens if North Korea continues to provoke, and at what level? Because public opinion in China remains concerned about the instability on the Korean Peninsula. Xi can tolerate a certain amount of diplomatic dissonance between Washington and Pyongyang, but it can't go too far. I don't know whether that amounts to a strategy, however, whether it's a firmly calibrated approach or whether it's simply an effort to contain the challenge of North Korea. Because in a way, the continuing division of the Korean Peninsula works in China's interests. The very fact that a transactional Donald Trump is putting alliance relationships on such acute strain creates the potential of a wedge between Washington and Seoul. We shouldn't underestimate that. That's in China's interests. We saw that, of course, in the very acrimonious discussions between Beijing and Seoul over THAAD deployment. An interesting question is whether doubts and uncertainty in Seoul, and I'd be interested to hear Chung Min's view on this, about the reliability of the US-South Korea alliance relationship, will force South Korea, even under a progressive president, to embrace a more autonomous and independent security policy, reinforced, of course, by that demographic pressure in terms of numbers within the South Korean armed forces. All of this happening at a time when, again, trilateral cooperation between the US, Japan, and South Korea is arguably not working very efficiently. Alongside that, there is, of course, the economic logic brought about by COVID-19 that is actually encouraging renewed efforts in the economic space, whether it's through the China, South Korea, Japan Free Trade Agreement discussions or RCEP, to increase trade cooperation between those three countries. So there are opportunities that emerge out of America's change in its leadership style under Donald Trump that serve China's interests. And I think the continuation of a contained security crisis on the Korean Peninsula is not necessarily at odds with the interests of the Chinese leadership, provided, of course, it can be contained. And that's the $60,000 question.
You know, Bill, if I may just add to that, John's, I guess, very, very lucid remark. I have nothing to add substantively, but I just wanted to share with the viewers today that, you know, many of my American friends and even my Japanese friends tell me in private, why is it that South Korea is not as vocal on the China threat as, for example, Japan is? And it seems as if South Korea is tilting more towards China than the US. And so many of my American friends are concerned that the South Koreans are shifting towards Beijing rather than Washington. And I explain it this way. Well, I first say, well, Donald Trump really has done a wonderful job of making the US a very unpleasant ally in many respects. And so the onus, I think, is on Donald Trump more than the South Koreans. But from a historical perspective, I think South Korea is one of the very unique countries on the planet that enjoys nearly 2,000 years of nearly unbroken historical ties with China that goes very, very deep at all levels of society. And for the last 70 years, one of the strongest economic and defense alliances with the Americans. And so here you have a very, you know, middle-sized middle power, a democracy that has the closest of ties with the two superpowers of the world. And I think for South Koreans, this is not a binary choice. Monday we're pro-America, Tuesday we're pro-Beijing, Wednesday we're neutral, Thursday, you know, our neck is broken. And so for South Koreans, the key issue here is how can we manage to live with both a rising China and a very critical ally in the US? And I think amongst many players in Asia, I cannot think of another country that has such deep ties, irreversible ties with both Washington and Beijing. That is something that the South Koreans have to figure out above and beyond their North Korea work. But my one final word on Chinese strategy on North Korea, I think what Xi Jinping really wants is North Korea is a problem, but not something that the Chinese worry about 24/7. And the reason is because the power gap between China and North Korea is so large that China can basically absorb whatever pretty much happens in North Korea. But I think for Xi Jinping's next 3-4 years, what he wants to do really is to weaken the US-South Korean alliance, decouple it as much as he can, and to also weaken the US, Japan, South Korea trilateral security cooperation by deepening the animosity between Japan and South Korea. That is, I think, Xi Jinping's critical goal on top of managing the so-called North Korea account.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Now, I mean, just continuing this theme for a moment, Christopher Purvis has asked a question: if China, following its toughness with Hong Kong, starts aggressive action against Taiwan, how would this impact North Korea, Korea relations, and Korea-Japan relations? And his wife Phillida has asked this rather. What you're saying, Chung Min, about China really not wanting to actually kind of influence matters in North Korea on a day-to-day basis, but nevertheless being on a strategic basis, liking the idea of South Korea-US relations being gradually eroding, being afraid, and therefore tilting some of the balance of power in the region. How would a Taiwan action or Taiwan pressure play into that? I mean, it wouldn't affect North Korean public opinion, but what would it do, would you think, in that?
Well, you know, John, why don't you go first and I'll follow.
Okay, John. Yeah.
Let me make some observations which I think are indicative of how fluid the international environment in the region is where Taiwan is concerned. We've seen Prime Minister Abe make some recent statements, you know, welcoming the re-election of the Taiwanese president, talking about Taiwan in a way that's quite a departure for what might have been described in the past as a policy of equidistance when it comes to relations between Japan and China and Japan and Taiwan. All of this is happening at a time when conservative sentiment within the LDP is exercised by what we've seen happening in Hong Kong. And the willingness of the Japanese government, I think, to take a tougher position, a more supportive position for Taiwan, is an effort, if you like, to respond to those internal pressures, but also consistent with Japan's concern about the rise of China as a non-status quo power, as a regime that is challenging Japan's interests. And all of this happening at a time, of course, when it's not just South Korea-US alliance relations that are arguably under threat, but so too Japan-US relations. The amount of energy that Prime Minister Abe invested in trying to reach out to Donald Trump way back when he was simply president-elect, you remember it was that visit to Trump Tower by Prime Minister Abe that was an attempt to cultivate the personal relationship. All of that has delivered relatively limited results from Japan's point of view. If you look at the trade negotiations between the two countries, Abe exposed on some of the agricultural issues, the Japanese still concerned about the potential of subsequent imposition of 25% tariffs on car exports to the United States. And when it comes to North Korea, to come back to this strategic question, a profound sense that Japan cannot trust the Americans. It's a distant, but I think unmistakable echo of the Nixon shock experience when Nixon first announced his willingness to visit China back in the 1970s, the early 70s. I was, in fact, in Tokyo in March of 2018 when the Americans announced the intention to meet with Kim Jong-Un in Singapore. And the mood on the part of both bureaucrats and politicians was palpable, that the Japanese felt that they had not been consulted, that this was yet another case of the White House acting unilaterally. We've seen further confirmation of that with the announcement that the G7 should be expanded to incorporate South Korea. You can understand the sensitivities of the Japanese, given the rivalry between those two countries, South Korea and Japan. So it would not be surprising to find Japan, as we're now starting to see, to explore in its own way a more autonomous defense policy. There is now an active discussion on the part of a committee organized and chaired by former Defense Minister Onodera, to consider the possibility of Japan engaging in preemptive action on the Korean Peninsula. The cancellation of Aegis Ashore, partly based on domestic political reasons and concerns on the part of public opinion that this is an unreliable system, but also indicative of pushback by Japan towards the United States on the question of host nation support. These are small changes, but again, it's very consistent with Japan's past pattern of incremental adjustments in its diplomatic and security posture that we should not overlook as a sign of fraying tensions. So when it comes back to China again, it's in China's interest to continue to try and exploit the fact that Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo are not in lockstep in the way they've been in the past. I think we're seeing under Mr. Abe a government that is more willing to act assertively and a little bit more independently. And that's probably smart diplomacy and smart politics on the part of the Abe administration.
You know, Bill,
you.
apropos what's happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan, I think both John and I'm sure you agree with me as well. Just a few days ago, the Chinese government passed the national security law in Hong Kong, and it's been basically happening over the last 24, 48 hours. And very brave Hong Kongers who are fighting for democracy have been arrested. And from a Chinese perspective, this is now a domestic issue. It's a done deal. And so as far as they're concerned, regardless of what the EU or what the Americans say, this is how China is going to rule Hong Kong. And I'm really sorry if you don't like it in the West. Well, it's too bad. I think it also poses, however, a critical moral question for Asia's leading democracies, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Australia, or even India farther out. And that is, if we want Asia to really prosper in the 21st century, I believe deep in my heart that Asia can be both free and rich. And that is, I think, the benchmark by which the Japanese, and by and large, the South Koreans have succeeded over the last 30, 40 years. But what we are seeing in Hong Kong is not just a trampling of human rights. We're seeing, I think, what the Chinese are now beginning to say, which is, it is either my way or the highway. And as far as Taiwan is concerned, that's a close deal from the Chinese perspective. The South China Sea, that really is no longer an American sea anymore. And so what we're seeing is a much more aggressive China over the last 3-4 years, but particularly under Xi Jinping in the last 3-4 weeks. So I think going forward, this will create very new dilemmas for all of America's allies and partners in the region, but in particular members of the Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and Japan. South Korea doesn't want to join the Quad because you don't want to gang up on China from South Korea's perspective. But deep down inside, the sense of angst, the sense of concern over the next 5-10 years is very, very deep in South Korea. And this is why I think, in as much as President Moon and the current government wants to, I guess, deepen ties with the PRC for very good reasons, there's also a realization by many South Koreans, regardless of your political inclinations, that getting into bed too early with China will have huge opportunity costs for Korea. And so therefore, we have to sustain our close alliance with America. But then this comes back to John's question, is America willing to lead? And that's a question that I think Mr. Trump has definitely said, which is he's not willing to lead at all.
Well, yeah, that's fascinating. Yes, I mean, or he's willing to lead only in his my way or the highway.
That's right. Yes.
Method.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. He certainly won't consult. At any rate, now let's just move back into North Korea for a second, and we'll come into international relations again in a moment. But a number of questions have asked about internal issues in North Korea and where it's heading, which I think is summed up a bit by a question Simon Shelton has asked: what do both speakers believe to be North Korea's desired end game? Is nuclear power status an end in itself to provide enhanced security, or is there more? Because McLean adds a question about light on Kim's possible successors, and the future of the Kim dynasty, all of which is also to bracket together with John's point in his remarks about the provocations and how precarious are issues. Depending on what we think are North Korea's ambitions and its endgame, what is it prepared to do to be able to achieve that? And how dangerous is it to Japan and to the rest of the region? Who would like to come in first on that?
Well, let me just go quickly on this and turn to to John. The key issue here is, if you look at the regime in North Korea, it is a combination, in my opinion, of three clusters. You have a royal family dynasty, you have a huge criminal cartel, and then you have one of the world's largest armies armed with nuclear weapons. So this is a large mafia state with nuclear weapons that is run by a hereditary communist dynasty. Kim Jong-un, however, is a very smart young leader. He knows the outside world unlike any of his predecessors. He has met with Trump and Xi Jinping and Putin and President Moon and others. And yet the dilemma that Kim Jong-un faces is this. He wants sanctions relief without giving up nuclear weapons. He wants to modernize the North Korean economy without opening it up like China. He wants better relations with the South Koreans, but without giving up his, leverage because of South Korea's spectacular economy. So on that score, over the long term, unless Kim Jong-un does a major U-turn and emulates Vietnam or China, his endgame is quite clear. It is muddling through because he will not be able to afford this policy of spending 25% of his GDP on defense, whereas his economy is tanking. So I think in that sense, that's the dilemma that he will not be able to move out of. My last word on this in terms of succession, people talk about this all the time. Kim Jong-un is not worried about succession at all. He is propping up Kim Yo-jong as his de facto number 2, only because I think his children are quite young and they're not old enough to be trained as the next crown prince. And so he wants to make sure that the nomenclatura, the people who support Kim Jong-un's regime in the party and the army, realize that, look, I might be young, I may not be in great health, but you also have to realize we are a Kim duo, and we will place this regime in North Korea for the next 30, 40 years. That's his game plan.
John?
Yeah, I think that's very important. The kind of time asymmetries are really important in all of this. Kim can afford to play a longer game. He doesn't obviously have to deal with the challenge of electoral politics. He is a young man. He is in a hurry, I think, to deliver economic prosperity. And as my Cambridge colleague Honek Kwon has often said, the theatre state of North Korea is an environment in which the appearance of success is hugely important. Whether that's the kind of bread and circuses focus that we've seen recently on tourism and trying to use construction as a means of underlining economic growth and prosperity. Kim needs to be able to continue to do that. And we see him doing that with signature initiatives, for example, the establishment of this new hospital that's supposed to be built in October to deal with COVID-19. Again, that exposes him to the risk of failure. But it's an open question of how secure the regime is in terms of its ability to weather disappointments in terms of the elite in Pyongyang. I agree also with Chung-min that the leadership is secure, and it's way too early to start speculating about potential successors. Kim Yo-jong's prominence is, I think, a measure of her personal proximity and closeness to the leadership, but we shouldn't interpret that mistakenly as a sign that anything is about to change. If I may, can I just say a few words about this question of moral resilience that Chung-min referred to? Because I do think it's a really important part in our thinking about the responses of South Korea and Japan, two vibrant liberal democracies, at a time when the US under Donald Trump seems to be compromising its commitment to some of those fundamental elements of US political identity. the rule of law, democratic transparency, support for democratic governments globally as well, of course, because of Trump's own flirtation with authoritarian leaders around the world, whether that's Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. This is creating, I think, a new political vacuum that states that South Korea and Japan should be, given their own political heritage post-war, able to fill. And yet there isn't the appetite. And that's what makes, I think, the current tension between Seoul and Tokyo so, perhaps it's an exaggeration to describe it as tragic, but certainly a missed opportunity. Really important that both politicians and civil servants seize the opportunity to both telegraph the importance of protecting these valuable institutions and values and make good in a substantive way. It's probably not possible for Seoul and Tokyo to do this independently. We need a new, to repeat a familiar phrase, coalition of the willing. But it's a coalition of the willing that's going to identify political values as much as strategic interests. And there is a real tension, I think, at the moment between the willingness of states to pursue their national interest at the expense of these wider global universal values.
Just a footnote, Bill, on that.
Yep.
It's a very sad, I guess, moment in Korean political history when the progressives who fought so hard to maintain and to bring democracy to South Korea in 1987 from President Kim Dae-jung onwards. And yet it is the progressive governments who have been quite mute on the gross violations of human rights in North Korea. I'm not saying we have to wear human rights on our sleeve all the time, but as John said, as one of Asia's most vibrant democracies, it behooves us to support democracies worldwide, whether through civil society, through academia, but also by our political leadership.
But is that following on from that? Thank you. A questioner has asked Linggu Guan about the domestic situation in the Republic of Korea. How popular is the peace policy towards the north now, and how enduring is that likely to be?
Just last week, there was a major opinion poll conducted by one of our big think tanks on unification. And one of the findings was 90% of South Koreans believe that North Korea will not give up nuclear weapons. And so most Koreans believe that yes, we have to try to convince the North Koreans for dialogue, to basically negotiate this thing away, give them incentives, normalize relations with the US and the Japanese. But at the same time, I think Koreans realize at the end of the day, the real, I guess, leverage that we have in safeguarding our security is a strong and resilient alliance with the US and also a very close US-Japan alliance. And that, however, is being impeded by, as John said, this really tragic downturn of relations between Japan and South Korea. And that is something that I think leaders of both South Korea and Japan must really realize, is that the longer term opportunity cost for this vital relationship to go down under is, I think, really damaging both to Tokyo and Seoul and for Asia on the whole.
And what can be done about that? What can Japan and South Korea do to reconcile their differences, and what, if anything, can outsiders do to assist in this process, including America, but also perhaps the UK? Chung Min, with you, carry on, and then on to John.
Yes, I'll be very quick on this. South Koreans can be extremely rational and logical on almost any issue, except when it comes to Japanese-Korean relations, because this is such a deeply embedded historical legacy. It lives and breathes in every single Korean's DNA. As much as it is, however, a very deeply emotional and painful issue, I think the younger generation South Koreans realize that there's a lot more in common between Korean and Japanese society than that divides them. At the beginning of this webinar, I talked about demographic trends. Well, Japan and South Korea are the world's fastest aging and shrinking populations amongst the OECD period, and that trend will not be reversed. And so I think it makes eminent sense that if you want to retain competitiveness in the global economy in the post-COVID era, Koreans must work with the Japanese and vice versa. It's not a choice. We have to work together.
John, final word on this, and then I'll close.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would fully endorse what Chung-Min is saying. There needs to be more cooperation, and there are powerful rational incentives. But I think, one thing that's really striking in the bilateral relationship is the increasing prominence of emotional responses. I mean, I include in this both the Japanese and the Koreans at senior levels of leadership. Japan is now, I think, showing, and the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, a real sense of irritation and frustration. And whether or not it's justified is kind of beside the point. It's important to be able to get beyond that. But this is part of a broader trend that we're seeing on the part of leaders and national electorates across the world. It's partly driving the populist phenomenon. What Jonathan Haidt, the moral psychologist, describes as the righteous mind, the tendency of us to think. I think Chung-Min mentioned Donald Trump's instinct to think with his gut. It's not just Donald Trump, it's plenty of leaders, whether it's Modi or Abe or even President Moon. We need a framework for understanding why those emotions are so powerful and to find a mechanism for managing them and containing them. Part of that is institutional. Part of that is re-establishing the pipes, as the Japanese call them, that link together politicians in both Seoul and Tokyo. Part of it is actually trying to dial down the rhetoric. And I think both President Moon and Prime Minister Abe in this year's New Year's address, President Moon in the March 1st commemoration ceremonies, both made, I think, efforts in that direction. We need more of that. Leaders need to lead, and they need to avoid inflaming these tensions at the grassroots level. But the fact that they're there is something that we can't wish away at this point, or even assume that national interests will overcome.
Well, thank you. That's a very fitting note on which to close this excellent discussion. Been very wide-ranging, but I've learned a terrific amount from it, and I think our audience have too. I've neglected 4 questions from one questioner, all about the specific capabilities of North Korea, which I think I will copy and send to you both, and perhaps you can reply to them directly to Nicholas MacLean. But mainly, I just want to thank both of you for contributing your time and your expertise in such a marvelous way on this very important issue. Next week, on Wednesday, Japan Society will welcome Prime Minister Abe's special advisors and a speechwriter, Tomohiko Taniguchi, to talk about the value that Japan puts on Britain in its relationship, and from the British end, our former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt MP, will give the corresponding remarks about what Japan and Britain mean to each other, and what sort of relationship we can expect and how we can work together if we can. At last, just as a final thank you to all the attendees for your excellent questions and for sparing the time, but very much to Chung-Min Lee and to John Nilsson-Wright. Thank you so much. Have a great day and great evening, Chung-Min.